here because I think he's, I could say, even famous in our cultural studies cycles dealing with cultural memory. And it is Professor Jeffrey Olick from University of Virginia. I'm almost sure that everyone knows his publication like The Politics of Regret, or last but not least, the collective memory reader that he edited together with our two MC members, Vered Winicki-Serusi, who is sitting here, and Daniel Levy, whom you met in Skopje last year. So welcome to Jeffrey. Thank you that you accepted our invitation. He came a long way from US. And after Jeffrey's speech, our commentator will be Anne Rigney, who is working group leader and professor of comparative literature at Utrecht University. Please.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you very much for the invitation. The previous speaker referred to the social psychology of historical representations group, the other cost action, and because I'm a member of neither of these groups, I somehow ended up getting to go to both conferences, and it's interesting to compare and always provocative to have the different institutional and disciplinary frameworks, not to mention the very different places in the world which encourage you to think about the incredible complexity of memory and of memory studies, let alone of memory politics. And in fact, my talk today is about complexity. It's not that we necessarily need to be reminded that the world is a complex place and that the problems we analyze are very complex. But in my experience, there are two major frameworks of scholarly rhetoric. One framework is, look, if you just see things through this one framework, everything will become clear, because it's really all about this or it's all about that. And the other reflex is to say, oh my God, it's so incredibly complex that we'll never make sense out of it. And I'm afraid that I'm a scholar of the latter kind, that is, that I see complexity where other people see simplicity. I always start out, sometimes I start out by saying there are two kinds of sociologists, and somebody always shouts, yeah, the ones who divide the world into two types and the ones who don't. So I am the kind that divides it into the two types, but I'm the latter type. Okay. A little background to what I want to do today. I want to introduce and talk about two concepts. Two constructs for thinking about the complexity of memory. I want to talk about regions of memory and systems of memory, and try to unpack what it is that I mean by these concepts. And a little bit of background for why I do this. Many of you, most of you, all of you are familiar with our dear colleague Astrid Errol and her work. Astrid is an important part of this group, I understand, but is not able to be here. Astrid wrote, among many other terrific things, she wrote a really terrific paper in 2011 in a journal called Parallax, where she outlines basically the recent history, not the recent history, the entire history of memory studies, which she divides into three periods or three waves. The first period is the discovery, if you will, that memory is more than simply the quality of individuals and what they contain in their heads, but as a social, collective, shared, public process that it transcends the container of the individual mind. And this is usually associated with the work before World War II, not only Ebbinghaus and Wundt and founding fathers of experimental psychology, but Maurice Halbwachs most prominently, also Frederick Bartlett, and many others in that period. The second wave of memory studies for Astrid is the sort of the lieu de mémoire period, starting in the late 1970s and going up through about 2000 or so, where the main preoccupation seems to be the connection between memory and national identity. The memory-nation nexus, as Nora refers to it. And many studies of the problems of memory in particular countries within the so-called container of the nation state. What Astrid describes as the third wave, to which she and Anne and many others in this room have contributed, is the overflowing of the so-called container of the nation state, the discovery of transcultural, transnational, and in some versions global memory flows and processes. And it's this notion of memory beyond the nation state that I'd like to address my concepts of regions and systems of memory. I should say, though, that I do so from the perspective of a second waiver. That I myself still do most of my research on the container of the nation state. I'm particularly interested in the problems of memory for national legitimation. And I think we risk in moving from the second stage, the second wave, to the third wave, which is a very important move in expanding our horizons. I think we sometimes risk throwing out the baby of the state's power to define memory and set agendas with the bathwater of the idea that the nation is the overwhelming or even only container or source of collective identities. So when I'm talking about the third wave, I'm talking about it admiringly, but still with at least one foot very strongly in the second wave studies. The more proximate incentive or occasion for my thinking about a notion of regions of memory and systems of memory comes from another collaboration I have with colleagues in Warsaw as part of the Genealogies of Memory conference. And I don't know if any of you have been to those conferences or know about that group. But one thing I noticed in the first two meetings I went to in Warsaw, there are, as many of you know, because I see many of you at these conferences, there are lots and lots of overlapping networks in memory studies, and we have meetings in all sorts of fascinating places. And every time I try to get out of memory studies, I get pulled back in by another enticing invitation. It's a cheap and good way to see the world, right? But I go from country to country nomadically, and interacting with the local groups that often sponsor, what I hear is people saying, well, you don't understand, we're different. Memory here is not like memory everywhere else. And it began to remind me of the opening of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, that I never quite get it right, every happy family is the same and every unhappy family is unique. If you go to enough memory conferences in enough different countries, you begin to see that, well, maybe memory trouble with memory is not all that unique. You begin to see the patterns, despite the insistence of the locals that no, it's completely different here and nothing compares. Well, this gives you some perspective that makes it possible to generalize, which of course, despite the complexity, is the goal of what we're doing. One of the early conferences in the Genealogies of Memory project emphasized the uniqueness of what they called Central and East Central Europe. This was also a new construct, that whether we're referring to Central, half the conference was a debate on whether we're referring to Central Europe, or there's something unique called East Central Europe. And sort of divide and divide and divide until you're done. But this, in comparison to a previous conference I was at, actually the previous one was in Hiroshima, where the topic was so-called Northeast Asian memory, the memory problems that arise in Northeast Asia. So the triangle of Korea, South Korea, Japan, and China. Which was focused on its set of issues, whether it was comfort women or the Nanjing massacre or Japanese imperialism. But the memory system there seemed to be focused on this particular event. The idea that came out to me is that as we move from the container of the nation to ideas of global or cosmopolitan memory, maybe we're taking too big a leap. And that there's a missing level of memory organization, somewhere between the nation state and the global or the cosmopolitan. And I began to think about so-called regions of memory, or memory regions. And that this is an important factor in our analysis of the memory debates and the memory contests that occur in different parts of the world. So, and in fact, many of the groups that have been organized in memory studies and to study memory around Europe, for instance, or in Northeast Asia, have been focused on these regional concerns. So again, Central and East Central Europe as a region, you know, with Romania and Hungary and Poland and the former East Germany and Ukraine, and the unique sets of problems what Timothy Snyder called the Bloodlands, for instance, as a region of memory. There's also, as I already mentioned, the Northeast Asian memory region. We can, in some sense, imagine a memory region constituted by France, Germany, and the Benelux countries over World War II, though also we can imagine a different memory region that's constituted by the three what used to be three German-speaking nations surrounding World War II, namely East Germany, West Germany, and Austria, which had their own set. There's also now, I know Barbara has been powerful, I don't get the name wrong, the Nordic, whether we, what Nordic, I guess, is meant to transcend the two sub-regions of Baltic and Scandinavian. And we can divide things up in larger and small groups. So it's clear that there is a continuum of units that range up from the nation state, which is institutionally constituted by all sorts of real hard things like governments and armies and borders and passports and seats at the United Nations and things like that, all the way up to the global or cosmopolitan, if that exists. But in between there are regions of various size and constitution. And so what I wanted to do was to articulate a notion of the place of the region as a fundamental unit of analysis for the study of memory. And so one of the ways I did that is to start to make a list of the kinds of constructs we might use in the analysis of memory. So, you know, we can read in Maurice Halbwach's about family memory, or about religious memory, or various kinds of group memory. So here we're at the second from the bottom and the third from the bottom. This is, in some sense, meant to be in dialogue or as an alternate to older notions of personal or individual or psychological memory, which I'll have something to say about in a minute. I mean, there's lots of things in between, and these are just sort of archetypes. But we move from the personal to the familial to the factional or organizational to the national to the regional and the global or the universal. And I wanted to show that regional sits and is powerful as a force between the national and the global. But then I began to realize, of course, that this begins to look like the analysis of memory is like the unpacking of a Matryoshka doll. That is, you have the larger one and you take that out and set it aside and you just keep going until you get to the original one. The couple of problems with that, first of all, in a Matryoshka doll, the only solid doll is the internal, the personal or the individual. There's a core there, and you think about how you make these things. You start with a hard nugget and then you add on and add on. And so that privileges, I think, the personal or the individual, which I want to, as a sociologist, I want to reject. But it also seemed to me that the flows or the complexities of transculturality, if you will, the ways in which memory is nested are vastly more complex than are represented on the thinking of the Matryoshka doll. So, for instance, an individual might be contemplating or in dialogue with or affected by the global or the universal in a way that is not mediated or does not pass through these other outer shells of the individual memory. And so one can imagine, I tried to do this, but my PowerPoint skills were not quite up to it. What you could start doing is you could start drawing, first of all, the hierarchical links among each of these elements. You draw an arrow between familial and personal, and you understand how your view of history is shaped by the fact that your father was involved with an organization and the family either talks about it or doesn't talk about it. And so this is This is the kind of thing that Harald Welz's work gets at. Opa war kein Nazi. Grandpa wasn't a Nazi. You know, how is memory of historical events transmitted within the family context, or not, as the case may be. You can move up from the family memory system to the factional or organizational level. So you could look at the ways in which Protestants versus Catholics remember a particular historical event in a different way. And you can make each of these kinds of links. And so we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 links that were worthy of analysis. But in fact, it's an awful lot more than 5 links. Because it could be that the personal is affected not primarily by the familial, but by the factional or the organizational. So we need a 7th link that goes from there, but we also need from the personal to the national. There are contexts in which you are representing or thinking or shaped at a very individual level by your feelings of national identification, maybe unmediated by the systems of the family or the factional. So then you go 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, then you go from familial to factional, and you multiply out a combinatorial matrix of different kinds of complexity that explode this very linear hierarchical way of thinking about Matryoshka dolls. That memory systems are nested in this way. Okay. But that was too simple. Right? And I decided that actually it needs to be complexified in yet another way. One of the constituent features of any memory system is not merely the institutional situation in any synchronic framework. That is, at this particular time in 2015, how is the personal memory of some of 1989, for instance, mediated or shaped by your family's experiences in 1989, or perhaps shaped by your experiences of 1989 are going to be different whether you are in France, where, yes, 1989, the fall of the Soviet Union, is a significant historical event, but not one that affects you in the same personal way as if you live in Berlin, which of course affects you in a different way than 1989 affects you if you lived, for instance, in Kaunas. Different kinds of structures because different national and even regional dynamics are at play. Not only is that the case, but the question of whether it's 1989 or some other event, either in more recent history or in farther back history, that may be affecting the event. So it's not only the nesting of all of these different combinatorial possibilities of structural units, but there's also a nesting of temporal units. And this ties up to earlier work I did on what I called genre memory, where what I was looking at, I had just sort of discovered a difference which led me to theorize that I had read a speech in 1985, or a speech that was given in 1985 by Richard von Weizsäcker, who actually just died a little while ago. Von Weizsäcker was the president of Germany. He had a very complicated personal history, but this was in 1985. It was 40 years after the end of World War II, and it was in the midst of debates about the meaning of the Nazi past for contemporary Germany. And von Weizsäcker gave a speech which was sort of a masterpiece of balance. On the one hand, we can't be tied to this history. On the other hand, we can never forget this history. And was hailed as a great compromise and sort of a settling that we're never going to put this behind us, but we still have to look towards the future. And it was distributed worldwide, and it was hailed as this great act of statesmanship and leadership. But the problem is I have read just about every speech that the German leadership over 50 years have given about the Nazi past, and it rang familiar to me. And so I went back and looked at the 1975 speech on the 30th anniversary, and what I saw is that large portions of the 1985 speech were almost identical to the 1975 speech. And yet in 1975, nobody cared. It didn't matter at all. And so this led me to develop what I call genre memory, which is to remember that the historians teach us to look at the way in which a representation of the past matches or doesn't match what actually happened. So you look at what happened in 1945. Was it a liberation or was it a defeat for Germany? And you look at the speech in 1975 or 1985 and you ask, does that accurately represent what happened? Or you read Hallwachs and you become a memory scholar and you're interested not in the relationship between what actually happened, wie es eigentlich gewesen, and the representation. Rather, you look at the relationship between the representation and what's going on at the particular moment. So, why did somebody give this speech? What were the political pressures? What were the interests? Memory is created in the present for present purposes. But this comparison of the 85 and the 75 speeches made me realize that both of these things are true, but neither of them is the complete picture, or even together are they the complete picture. Rather, we need to understand representations of the past as moments in ongoing dialogues. That the minute an event happens, we are already beginning to commemorate it. You can find a quote on this in Hegel's Philosophy of History, that the interpretation of the event is almost simultaneous with the event itself. So that every commemorative speech or every representation of the past is referring not just to the event being commemorated, and is not just an expression of the political circumstances of the present, but is in dialogue with all the previous representations, all the previous commemorations. The term I used for this was the memory of memory. Last time I was in Warsaw, I found a great example of this, what I call the commemoration of commemoration. If you go to the Rappaport Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, right, the famous one where Willy Brandt went and knelt, if you walk a little bit over to the side of the square, about 10 meters away, there's actually a commemoration of Willy Brandt falling on his knees. So that's a commemoration of a commemoration. So we get into the la-la land of meta-memory, or I call it the memory of memory, or the commemoration of commemoration. It's very clear that what we're doing is we're interpreting not just events, but we're always commenting on earlier events. And so this is I take the notion from Bakhtin that there's an ongoing discourse in time. So how does that match with the Matryoshka doll? Well, we need to pay attention to the different temporal wavelengths of memory. Now, this is a very old notion in historiography, the model of the longue durée, then the cyclical movements, or the right up to the events or the conjunctures. That's one way to describe it. We know, for instance, that there are multiple different temporalities occurring at any given moment, ranging from evolutionary time, civilizational time, epochal time, period time, or eventful time. I realize those aren't very good names, epochal time and period time. I guess what I would say is the epoch is the modern era, or the Enlightenment, or the long 19th century, whereas the period might be the decade or a couple of decades. Or eventful time, another way to lay this out. And of course, different kinds of memory might correspond to these different temporal frameworks. We have episodic memory, what happened this morning or what happened last week. We have period memory, the sense of the decade or what we're living through now. This then becomes communicative memory in the way that both Hallwachs, Osman, and Vedza talk about sort of the period of 3 generations in which your grandparents can tell you the story. There's an organic connection of generations to then what becomes sedimented in cultural memory, or what Hallwachs called collective memory, which whereas he has a different distinction. He talks about collective history being dead memory. Collective memory is what happens in 3 generations. History becomes when there's no longer an organic relationship. We can talk about the different frameworks, the temporal frameworks, the present, the recent past, the seculum, the old notion of your 310, the lifetime of 70 years, the generation, the modern era, and the modern culture. The problem for analysis that I'm trying to get at is that we get into the same kind of combinatorial dynamic when we're talking about temporality as when we're talking about the Matryoshka doll of the individual, the familial, local, the national, the regional, and the cosmopolitan. So we complexify with, if I draw on the model, it would have looked like a spider web of sorts, in 2 dimensions. So for instance, it's a little bit of an old model, but you think about a radio. Nobody listens to the radio anymore, where everything is digitally pre-tuned, but your radio receiver could simultaneously, the difference between the low end of the spectrum and the high end of the spectrum is the wavelength. When you tune your radio, you tune it to 96.3 or 102.5, you're changing the wavelength that's being perceived. That wavelength, you can then get a shortwave radio, or you can look at different kinds of wavelengths. All of those wavelengths are going through us in our lives simultaneously, and somehow one of the miracles of human existence is our ability to exist in this continuum of different wavelengths at any given time. So you can think about, I've been going on for 20 minutes, don't worry, you're more than halfway through, right? You're thinking about the temporality of my talk, you're also thinking about the temporality of the day, when am I going to get my lunch? But you're also talking about the temporality of the conference, you're talking about, well, this is 2015, what's going on this academic year. Then you think also about your adulthood and your lifetime, and you think about the century, and you also think about the modern era, and again, you end up also thinking about evolutionary time. And all of these waves are passing through us at the same time, and we're incredibly adept at switching our temporal frames of reference from the most brief to the longest, and existing in these multiple frameworks. And so when we're referring to any particular memory problem, we have to keep in mind also that our frame of reference is always multiple and complex. So when we're commemorating or thinking about something like 1989 in Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's no way to do that without thinking about the framework of 20th century history. There's no way to think about 1989 without thinking about 1945. And of course, no way to think about that without thinking about 1648 or 1789, or in fact the Pleistocene era, at the invention of the wheel or the Gutenberg galaxy, or all of these kinds of things, all of which are shaping the frameworks of memory. So what I want to do here is to try to understand regions of memory as systems that are constituted in these multi-dimensional ways, such that we can, as I already did, we can look at examples of memory regions. So as I said, Northeast Asia, Japan, China, South Korea, and the issues that they're dealing with: imperialism, comfort women, Nanjing, the Pacific War. Or we can look at Oceania, New Zealand, Australia, New Caledonia, places like that, where the issues are expropriation, stolen children, Australia, New Zealand, Commemoration Day. We could talk about the memory region of the so-called Southern Cone, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, etc., where the issues are the fall or transition from bureaucratic authoritarianism, which raises issues of the so-called disappeared, and issues of torture, and the topos of memory in the Southern Cone is about the disappeared, and is driven by mothers. Again, the Bloodlands, France, Germany, the Western Allies, all of these different regions of memory. But we have to understand the complex ways in which each of these memories, first of all, the constituent elements for each of these memory regions or memory systems is shot through with different temporalities, with different issue cultures, and that people may be relating to the same events through different temporal horizons, just as through different geographical or scale kinds of issues. And so one of the problems that I see in memory studies, again, is the idea that you can simplify what the memory issue we're talking about. So we're talking about 1989 in Poland, or we're talking about, and you see the complexity whenever I talk about write about post-war German memory of the Nazi period. And the first question we have to specify, but it's one that is specified in the course of commemoration, is whether we're talking about the Nazi war of aggression, whether we're talking about an authoritarian regime that lasted 12 or 13 years, depending on how you count, and there's some politics in whether you say 12 or 13, or whether we're talking about the Holocaust. And then, of course, Timothy Snyder's work says, well, what is this Holocaust thing? I like to provoke people by saying the Holocaust never happened. Not that there was not mass murder and genocide in Auschwitz and Birkenau, and that it was done on racial principle, but Snyder's work said, well, if we identify the Holocaust with the metonym of Auschwitz,